This is part 2 of the Bob Feingold Mercedes-Benz 2.316 video. In this video we'll take a look at the engine compartment. So starting just under the hood, literally, that Bob's made a custom pad underneath here on the hood, and it's fabricated a heat shield down there, which is a pretty good idea. Of course the exhaust manifold sits right under this part, so that was a pretty good idea, instead of having the black up there, to put a silver reflective piece and reflect the heat back down. And while we're looking at this area just underneath here, you can see that Bob has fitted a Mercedes-Benz E500 brake booster on here for more braking power. And you can't see it, but he also has a E500 master cylinder, and we'll show in another video what kind of brakes he has on here. They're quite big. And then also in this area you can see that he has the RMD Tech adjustable camber plates here on the left side, and of course the right side, and then one of these tower braces here to kind of stiffen up the chassis a little bit. The engine here, the valve cover says 2.516, but the engine, as far as I know, is really a 2.316. I'm not quite sure why he changed the valve cover, but that's what we have for the valve cover. And then over here is where the engine compartment gets really interesting, over here on the intake side. So this is completely different from a standard 2.316 valve. And what Bob has done is fitted a supercharger to this car. Now the supercharger is down here. It's a Rotrex supercharger, belt driven off the crankshaft, but that's over here. He's had to remove the power steering pump to fit it in here. The power steering pump is now underneath the alternator, upside down. We'll take a look at that later. But the RMD Tech supercharger is right here, and the air for the supercharger flows in from this side. Now, on a standard right-hand drive Mercedes 190E, this is where the battery's at, but he's taken the battery out, put it in the back as you saw in the other video, and then fitted a large air cleaner from a truck, and then fed that with a 75mm flexible pipe down to the supercharger. And then the exit from the supercharger is right here, and that flows over to a 65mm Nissan throttle body, and there is a blow-off valve right here that you can see in case the pressure gets too high. That exits out. There's no exit pipe, it just blows right out the front, it looks like. But a 65mm Nissan throttle body there. And then from the throttle body, this big intake plenum is a pretty interesting piece of design and engineering that Bob's made. This features a air-to-water intercooler, so he has a small radiator inside there filled with water that circulates up to the front with a separate cooling system. And so all the hot air that's coming out of the supercharger through the throttle body gets cooled by that radiator inside the plenum. And then there's a baffle, and it feeds up to here, this big intake plenum. And then that's been attached to a modified intake manifold from a 190/16 that he's cut it off, welded on this 10mm aluminum plate, so that all mounts up. And then that is attached to the engine, but you can see down, we'll try to zoom in. There you go. That he has a 10mm nylon block to reduce the amount of heat transfer from the engine up into the intake manifold. So that was a clever piece of engineering also. And then on top of the intake manifold is a fuel injection rail, a mega squirt system. And so all that's electronic fuel injection. He has the Ford EDIS ignition system over here, and then coil on plug type caps. I think they're CBR 600 from a motorcycle that he's fitted on. So that's what the intake and the ignition system looks like on this car. Let's start it up for a second. Can you start that up? There it is. So it starts up, it idles real fine, and it throttle whips up really cleanly, so I'll have to say that that's the sound of Bob Feingold engineering at its finest here. And so other things inside this engine, that to keep the engine from moving around too much, he's fitted a damper here. This is normally a belt tensioner on a Mercedes-Benz, but he fitted another one to keep the engine from rocking around. Not quite sure if you can see that, but that was pretty clever. And then this is the power steering reservoir. It's actually from a BMW, but on the standard Mercedes, that's attached to the power steering pump, which is normally where the supercharger is. But to fit the supercharger in, the power steering pump moved to the other side of the engine, and that's driven by this belt that he's made a special pulley for. The belt runs down to the bottom, and the power steering pump is mounted upside down, and so that's why you can't use the reservoir, because all the oil would run out in that type of configuration. So that's where the power steering fluid is, and that's where the pump ended up. Other things in here that you can see, he has a remote oil cooler over here. Normally that's attached to the intake manifold, but he ran out of space with all this other stuff that was fitted in, so he has a remote oil cooler or oil filter over there. And then in the front, there you go. That heat exchanger right there is for cooling the supercharger. The supercharger is a mechanical device, so it's got some oil in there. It has its own lubrication system, so that's the cooler for that. We have another oil filter and radiator and also the air conditioning system over here for cooling. And then I have to say I like these 2 extra red horns he fitted on there, because there's going to be a lot of slow vehicles in the way of this car. So that's a quick little look underneath the hood. In the next video we'll take a look underneath the car and show you what he has for suspension items.